Okay, in this series of videos, we're going to take a look at ratio analysis. We're going to be looking at a variety of different ratios and really focusing in on the return drivers and how to measure performance of firms by doing these different ratio calculations. So let's jump into it here and talk about the importance of ratios and why in particular we care about them. So the main thing that we're going to do with ratios is it starts to give us some sense of how a firm is performing over time, and it also allows us to compare the performance of the firm we're concerned with its peer group. We can look at other firms and compare the performance more easily, much more easily with ratios than by just looking at the raw numbers from the financial statements. So we are frequently using ratios as investors to get a sense of how well a firm is performing and what its prospects are for continuing to perform well, to generate cash flow, to return cash to investors over time as part of the return on their investment. We also care about ratios as a creditor. We can look at different measures and get a sense of the ability of a firm to handle its debt, how well it has handled it in the past, what its prospects are in the future. Has its use of debt grown kind of alarmingly over recent years? So all of these things inform creditors' decisions. And then managers also will frequently use ratios. It's a way to measure or assess the performance of divisions of a company or the company overall. And by focusing in on different ratio measures, managers can get a sense of where they need to focus their attentions to help the firm perform at its best. So a lot of different uses for ratios. And so let's jump into some ratio definitions and first talk about the variety of definitions that there are out there. So there's not just one universal definition for any particular ratio. So with ratio definitions, there are some parties or some groups of people that use different definitions on these ratios. The important thing is not necessarily the definition that is used, but that the definition is used consistently by an analyst. Over time for a company or looking between companies, to use the same definition is going to be the important thing. So as an example, for return on assets, there are a variety of different definitions that have been used. The most frequently used is net income over total assets. In our textbook, in our practice here, we're going to use net income available to shareholders, to common shareholders. So that we have the asterisk that you'll see here in a few slides. But it can also be defined as earnings before interest and taxes divided by total assets, EBIT over total assets. Some folks define return on assets as the net income adjusted for any extraordinary items divided by average total assets. So you look at the beginning total assets of the year, the ending total assets of the year, take the average of those two. So the point is there are certainly a possibility of a number of different definitions for any particular ratio. Again, the important thing is that you're using one consistently and applying it in all contexts. Another important thing about ratios is that there is a wide variety of ratios. It helps us to focus on what's important by looking at a variety of different viewpoints or variety of different measures. And in particular, I like to talk about this holistic picture of the firm. So we're going to start off by looking at the statement of cash flows, see what that tells us. Remember, we got the three buckets: the operating activities, the investing activities, and the financing activities. Each of those categories will tell us a bit about the firm. We can look at their NOPAT and get a sense of how the firm is doing in terms of operations. We can look at the return on invested capital, the free cash flow, and a variety of other things besides just these ratios that we're going to look through in this slide set to get a sense of how things are going. And then finally, with ratio etiquette, there are a few important things to keep in mind as you're using ratios. The most important is that you use ratios in an appropriate context, and that really means with appropriate benchmarks. So we're going to look at the performance of a firm over time. That's a very a good way to measure things. We got the same context because it's the same firm, and now we just have to keep in mind what's going on over periods of time. So if we're looking at ratios, for instance, from 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, we have to keep in mind the historical context that there was a large global recession happening in the middle of that. As we're looking at ratios across time, we want to keep in mind those things. Now, as we're comparing ratios between firms, we want to make sure, again, that we have an appropriate benchmark, that we're comparing apples to apples in a sense. We wouldn't want to compare a firm in the grocery business or the grocery industry to one in the high-tech industry, for instance. That would be kind of a nonsensical comparison to make. With those things in mind, let's jump into our ratios and take a look at the first set of ratios, the liquidity ratios. Liquidity ratios are intended to measure the firm's ability to pay their obligations on time. So we're especially focusing in on the next year. As you can see in the definitions here, we're always looking at the current liabilities, which again, from a definitional standpoint, are those obligations that have to be paid over the course of the next 12 months. So this is really about the near-term liquidity of the firm. How able are they to pay their obligations in the ensuing year? So there's three here that I'm going to focus on. The first one is the current ratio. That's simply defined as the current assets divided by the current liabilities. The second is the quick ratio. That's going to be defined as the current assets less the inventory, so the least liquid of the current assets. So we take that out and then we divide that again by the current liabilities. And then finally the cash ratio. This is the most liquid of the current assets, cash and cash equivalents. This would be things that are either cash now or you can quickly turn into cash. And we're going to divide that again by current liabilities. So that is in certain contexts, a more important ratio measure for liquidity. You'd like to know how many weeks, how many months of expenses you have and you can pay with your current cash. Certainly for young firms, for startup firms, it's important to know how long that runway is where there's cash available to pay the coming bills. Now, a quick comment on liquidity, and this will be true actually for a number of these ratios that we look at. There's never really an exact right answer, an exact right ratio. There's always going to be a context mixed in, and we will find situations where we can certainly be too low, potentially be too high. In this case with liquidity, there would be certainly the danger of having too low of a liquidity ratio. That would start to put into question the ability of the firm to pay its bills on time. That calls into question the ongoing viability of the firm. Perhaps there's considerations of bankruptcy if we can't pay our bills on time. But on the other hand, there is the possibility of having too high of a liquidity ratio. Now this would be the case where you have either have way too much cash or you have far too big of an inventory. That could inflate your current ratio, and it may turn out that much of that inventory is obsolete, or that you're holding an inordinate amount of cash. You have a high liquidity ratio, but you're being kind of wasteful with these resources. You could do something better, more beneficial for the firm. So too high, too low are going to both be bad for the firm. We want to try to find that Goldilocks ratio where it's in the just right zone. So as we talk through these, we want to always keep that in mind. There's a direction that's usually better than others, but we can always go too far to an extreme. So let's look at some example calculations as we wrap up this first video. And again, with the current ratio, we're looking at current assets over current liabilities. So for 2018 and 2017, the current assets are going to be in this line right here. We're going to divide that by the current liabilities, this line right here, and we get the results. Now, just in terms of interpretation, the liquidity has gone down a little bit from 2017 to 2018. Again, this is a firm that we've looked at in a number of our different other measures, and the story seems to be consistent as we look at these ratios. As we continue to march through this firm and look into other example ratios, we're going to see that there is a pretty serious deterioration in the performance of this firm. So this would be consistent with that. The firm is a little bit less liquid this year compared to last year. We could look at the quick ratio here. That's taking out the inventory. The inventory is by far the largest of the current assets, so that pushes the number below 1. And we have 0.71 for 2018, 0.80 for 2017. Again, there's been a slight deterioration in the quick ratio. And then for the cash ratio, if we look at those numbers, there's been basically a halving of the cash available. Last year, the cash and cash equivalents was $100 million. This year, it's 50. And our current liabilities have also grown. So this, again, from a cash ratio standpoint, our liquidity has taken a bit of a hit. So all of these together just suggest not necessarily that there's grave problems for the firm. Again, this liquidity ratio by itself doesn't tell us that. In the context of other ratios that we've looked at and will look at, there would start to be some serious concerns about this firm. But right now we're going to stop and we'll pick up in the second video with taking a look at asset management ratios, also called efficiency ratios. And so I'll see you then.
To myself, I didn't want you around. Those pretty faces always make you stand out in a crowd. Someone picked you from the bunch, and glance is all it took. And now it's much too late for me to take a second look.